A thigh bone breaking is not a quiet injury, and the leg does not take weight afterward, not that day, not that month. The thigh swells within the hour, filling with blood that has nowhere to go, and a body that walked all morning is now a body that cannot cross open ground on its own. Somewhere in the cold north, roughly 40,000 years ago, in the last of the daylight, he did not walk for months, and someone carried food to him on every one of those days. He broke his leg 40,000 years ago and survived. How? A thigh bone in a storage drawer is heavier than most people expect when they first lift one, dense along its whole length, cool to the touch in a room kept at a steady temperature all year, and shaped less like a straight rod than like something bent to carry weight, which is exactly what it was. It is the longest bone in the human body and the strongest, built to take the load of a person walking, running, climbing, crouching, carrying a child on one hip across broken ground for hours. Along the back of a healthy one runs a raised ridge, where the large muscles of the thigh attach, a line of roughened bone you can feel with a thumb, and the depth of that ridge tells you something about how hard those muscles pulled during life. One particular kind of thigh bone, though, does not look like the others in the drawer, because somewhere along its shaft it is wrong. There is a swelling there, a collar of bone thicker than the shaft above and below it, rough where the rest is smooth, and often the two halves do not line up quite straight, so the whole bone has a slight bend that no living leg was ever built with. That collar has a name and a cause. When a bone breaks, the body does not glue the two ends back together in their original shape. It floods the gap with blood, then builds a soft bridge of cartilage and immature bone across it, then hardens that bridge into a lumpy cuff that surrounds the break on all sides, and then spends years slowly filing that cuff back down toward the shape it started with. The filing down is never finished. The collar stays. It stayed while the person kept living, it stayed through however many years of walking came afterward, and it stayed in the ground for the whole time between then and now, which in some cases is around 40,000 years. That thickening is the part worth sitting with, because a break does not produce it, only healing produces it. A person who breaks a thigh bone and dies in the following days leaves a clean fracture, two sharp edges, nothing built across the gap, and archaeologists reading that bone can tell almost immediately that no time passed between the injury and the end. The collar is time. The collar means weeks went by, then more weeks, and the body was warm and fed the entire time it was building. It also means something the bone itself cannot say, and that is the part that stops people. A person with a broken thigh bone in a cold northern landscape 40,000 years ago could not walk to water, could not follow the group when it moved, could not go out and come back with anything. So the food that fueled all that bone building came from somewhere else, and it came every day for months, carried by someone whose own bones are not in the drawer and whose name was never a thing that existed. The bone healed. Someone brought food across that ground and kept doing it. That is the whole of the evidence, and it is enough. You may already know a very small version of this, and most people do. A bad ankle, a night after surgery, a fever that turned a short walk to a kitchen into a project with stages. Someone brought you water and you were embarrassed about it, and it lasted 2 days. Hold that feeling steady and stretch it out over an entire season in the cold with nothing to take for the pain, and you are at the edge of the thing this bone is recording. There is a caution to put here before going any further, and it belongs in the open rather than buried. Not every researcher agrees that a healed fracture by itself proves deliberate care. Some have argued that in mild climates, with easy water and easy food nearby, an injured adult might survive a long recovery with far less help than we assume, and that reading care into every healed bone risks reading our own values backward into people who left no explanation. That objection is worth taking seriously. What it does not survive is the specific case of a displaced thigh bone in a cold place. Consider what the first days alone would have required. A closed break of the femur bleeds internally, sometimes heavily, and the thigh can swell within an hour as blood fills the muscle around the fracture. Modern estimates of the blood lost inside a single closed femoral fracture run to roughly a liter, which is a substantial fraction of what a person carries. That volume has nowhere to go. It sits in the leg, which becomes hot and tight and enormous, and the person who owns that leg is already light-headed and cold at the fingers before anything else has happened. Thirst rises steeply after that kind of bleed, and thirst is the immediate problem, not pain. A person in that state needs water within hours, needs it repeatedly, and cannot cross even 50 paces of open ground to get it. In a landscape where night temperatures fell below freezing for much of the year, that same person also could not gather fuel, could not build up a fire that was dying, could not move closer to it. The most likely reading, and the one most researchers working on these injuries hold, is that survival in those conditions required another person present and willing. What that other person had to do is the shape of everything that follows. Water carried in something, and the things available to carry water in 40,000 years ago were not many. A folded piece of hide, a section of gut, a hollow bone, a large shell in some regions, or nothing at all, except repeated trips with cupped hands. Food carried back rather than eaten where it was found, which means less for the carrier on the spot and a decision made in favor of someone else every single time. Warmth meant drew nights that ran long at high latitudes, 16 hours of darkness in midwinter, with a fire that needed feeding through all of it. None of those tasks were done once. They were done again the next day and the day after that. Through the weeks when the soft bridge was forming across the break, through the weeks after that when the cuff was hardening, and then through more weeks still for a reason that becomes clear later and is the least obvious part of this whole story. What we can measure today is only one side of that arrangement. The bone with the collar tells us about the person who could not stand. It records the fracture, the swelling, the healing, the slight shortening of the leg afterward, the way the person walked for the rest of their life, with weight thrown onto the other hip. On the other person, the one doing the carrying, the record is close to silent. Bone does not thicken in response to loyalty. There is no cuff that forms on a person who spent 4 months walking an extra distance every morning. The strongest thing that can be said, and it is a strange kind of proof, is that the second person is visible only as the first person's survival, and that is the only trace they left anywhere. Today, a broken femur is a surgical rod, an X-ray, a discharge date measured in days, and a person on crutches complaining about stairs by the end of the week. The distance between that and what the drawer is holding is not a distance of intelligence, it is a distance of tools, and of who had to absorb the difference when the tools did not exist. What the bone will not tell you is the beginning. It records the healing beautifully and records the break itself only as damage, without cause, without hour, without weather. It does not say whether the leg went under a falling animal or under the person's own body weight on wet rock or under a rockfall in the dark. It does not say who was standing nearby when it happened, or how far from the fire they were, or how much daylight was left. For that, the bone has to be put back in the drawer, and the whole thing has to be run backward to the moment before there was anything to heal, to an ordinary afternoon going cold at the edges, in a place far enough north that the light was already leaving by mid-afternoon and the ground was hard underfoot, when a thigh bone that had carried a person everywhere they had ever been broke in a single instant and stopped being able to carry anything at all. The light in a northern autumn does not fade so much as tilt, dropping low and yellow across the ground by mid-afternoon, throwing long shadows out of every rise and every stone until the surface underfoot stops being readable, and the air by then has gone cold enough that breath shows and fingers have started to stiffen without anyone noticing they have. That is the hour when most of these injuries happen, in every landscape and every era for which anyone has records, because that is the hour when the light lies, and the body is tired, and the ground is not where it appears to be. What breaks a thigh bone is not a small thing. It is the strongest bone a person has, thick-walled, built to take several times body weight with every stride, and the force needed to snap the shaft of a healthy adult femur is on the order of what a car crash delivers, or a fall from a good height onto rock, or the weight of a large animal coming down across a leg that had nowhere to move. It does not break from a stumble. It breaks from one of the few events in a landscape capable of delivering that much force at once, which narrows the possibilities considerably. A fall from a ledge or a tree, a rock fall, a large animal, or the ground giving way under a person carrying a load. Whatever the cause, the break itself takes no time at all. The sound is reported by people who have heard it as a single crack close to the sound of thick green wood giving, and it comes before anything else does, before the leg registers what has happened, before the person is on the ground. Then the leg is on the ground in a shape it should not be in. A femur that breaks through its shaft does not stay in line, because the muscles of the thigh are among the largest in the body, and they pull hard along their own length. When the bone that held them apart is no longer continuous, those muscles contract and drag the two halves past each other, which shortens the whole leg by an inch or two within seconds and rotates the foot outward. That is why a badly broken thigh is recognizable across a distance to anyone who has seen one before. The leg is shorter than the other one, and the foot is pointing the wrong way, and neither of those things can be fixed by the person they are happening to. What follows in the first minutes is not mainly pain, though the pain is severe and constant and has no position that relieves it. What follows is bleeding on the inside, where nothing about it is visible for a while. The femoral shaft carries a rich blood supply through the marrow and along its surface, and a fracture tears all of it at once inside a sealed compartment of muscle. Modern trauma medicine estimates that a single closed femoral fracture can put something in the region of a liter of blood into the thigh, occasionally more, and none of it leaves the body or reaches the ground. It goes into the muscle. The thigh swells, tightening steadily over the first hour into something hard and hot that no longer resembles a leg, and the skin over it stretches until it shines. Meanwhile, the volume that has left circulation is doing what missing blood does everywhere. The heart speeds up to compensate. The small vessels at the surface clamp down to protect the core, and the hands and feet go cold and pale, while the person becomes thirsty in a way that ordinary thirst does not prepare anyone for. That thirst is the first true emergency, arriving well before infection or hunger or anything that sounds more dramatic. It arrives while the sun is still up. You know a fraction of this. Most people have had a blunt go badly enough that standing became a negotiation, or a fever that turned the distance to a kitchen into a route with stages and rest points. And remember the specific indignity of needing water and having to ask. That version resolves. Someone hands over a glass. The arrangement lasts a day or two, and it becomes a story told lightly afterward. In a cold landscape 40,000 years ago, the same need arrived with the same urgency, and the resolution did not exist in any form that could be reached. There was nothing to take for the pain that would touch pain of that magnitude. There was no way to splint a femur that would hold against the pull of those muscles for long. There was no one to send for who was not already standing there, and no arrangement to be made with anyone beyond the small number of people within earshot. There was only what those people decided to do in the next hour, with the light going. And the light was going. The first task in that hour, in any climate cold enough to matter, was not the leg. It was getting the person off the ground, because the ground in a northern autumn draws heat out of a body faster than air does, and a person already low on blood volume loses temperature far more quickly than a healthy one. Hide, dry grass, brush, anything at all between skin and soil. Then fire, or moving the person to where fire already was, and the distance involved in that move is the part that is difficult to think about clearly. A grown adult with a fresh femoral fracture cannot be lifted cleanly by one person, cannot be dragged without the broken ends grinding against each other, and cannot help. Every yard covered had to be covered by other people carrying, and every yard of it went through the fracture. Whether the distance was 30 paces or half a mile, it had to be crossed before dark, in the cold, with a load that made noise. The archaeological record cannot show us that crossing. Nothing about it survives. What survives is only the fact, visible on the collar of thickened bone in the drawer, that it was crossed successfully, at least often enough for some of these injuries to heal. Then night, which at those latitudes in autumn runs 14 hours and is still lengthening, and which cannot be rushed. Pain from a fresh femoral fracture does not settle. It stays at the same level hour after hour, worsening with any movement of the leg, including movements the person does not choose, because a body that is cold shivers, and shivering moves a broken femur. 14 hours of that. In the same darkness, the swelling in the thigh continued to build toward its peak, which in a closed femoral fracture is generally reached somewhere in the first day or two, and the pressure inside the muscle rose along with it. Water was needed repeatedly through that night by a person who was in no condition to be moved again and who could not sit up unaided, which means someone brought it in the dark more than once and stayed close enough to know when it was needed. There is a caution to keep here. We cannot know what any particular group did on any particular night, and no site preserves a night. What the healed bones allow is a narrower and more reliable claim. Whatever was done, it was enough to keep the person warm and hydrated through the phase when most of the deaths from this injury occur, and it was done by people who had no way to know how long it would be needed. That is the part that separates this from ordinary help. Nobody in that group had a number. There was no way to say 4 months, no way to say the leg will bear weight again by spring, no way even to be confident the person would be alive by the next full moon. The work started anyway, in the dark, on the first night, with no estimate of the end. Two things are true about that night at the same time, and both are ordinary rather than remarkable. The person on the ground did nothing except keep breathing and keep shivering. Everyone else did the entire rest of it. By the time the sky began to grey, the thigh had reached close to its full size, and the person could no longer be moved without several people. The fire had been fed through the whole of the dark, and someone had been awake for most of it. Nobody had eaten properly. The break was less than a day old. By the second morning, the swelling in the thigh had not gone down, which is what surprises people who have never seen a large fracture up close and expect the worst of it to be over once the injury is a day old. Swelling in a closed femoral fracture generally continues to build for somewhere between 1 and 3 days before it peaks. And what is building is not simply fluid, it is the body's entire repair operation arriving at once. Within hours of a break, the clot that formed between the bone ends begins to be invaded by cells that clear away dead tissue, and those cells release chemical signals that widen the blood vessels around the whole area, pull fluid out of the circulation into the tissue, and raise the local temperature by several degrees. That is inflammation. And it is not a malfunction. It is the first stage of healing, and nothing further can happen without it. The thigh on the second day was therefore hot to the touch across its whole length, tight enough that the skin over it had gone shiny and slightly translucent, and in some cases blistered along the front, where the swelling had lifted the outer layer of skin away from what lay beneath. Any pressure on it was intolerable. So was any movement of the leg, including the movements nobody chooses. And in a landscape where the night temperature sat close to freezing and the person had lost a substantial volume of blood, involuntary movement was constant, because a cold body shivers, and shivering runs through the thigh like everything else. Alongside the local heat came a systemic one. The same signals that widen vessels around a fracture also travel and reset the body's temperature target upward, which is why a major break commonly produces a mild fever in the first days, even when no infection is present at all. It is generally a modest rise, a degree or so above normal, sometimes running for 2 or 3 days and sometimes longer with an injury of this size, and it would have been indistinguishable from the beginning of an infection to anyone watching. What that fever costs is the part that matters here. A raised body temperature burns fuel faster, and so does the repair work itself, and the combined effect on a person with a fractured femur is a metabolic demand well above their normal resting level, with modern estimates for major fractures often falling somewhere in the range of a fifth to a quarter above baseline and staying there for weeks. Turn that around and the shape of the problem becomes clear. A person who cannot move, who does nothing all day except lie still and be cold, needs more food than they did when they were walking and hunting and carrying loads. The output has fallen to zero, and the intake has to rise every day. For as long as the healing takes, fever also takes water, faster than most people estimate, through sweating and through breathing that runs quicker and warmer than usual, and it arrives on top of a body already short of a liter of blood volume from the day before. Thirst in that state is not the thirst of a dry afternoon. It is continuous, and it is the thing the person asked for over and over across those days, and it was the single most repeated task anyone did. Consider what a drink of water required. There were no pottery vessels 40,000 years ago in any part of the world. Fired ceramic containers do not appear in the record until much later, and in most regions far later. Water had to be moved in whatever was available, which meant a folded hide, a length of animal gut tied at one end, a hollowed section of large bone, a piece of bark bent into a shape that leaked slowly, or nothing at all, in which case it meant cupped hands and short distances. None of those hold much. A hide bag carried maybe as much as a person could drink in one long go, and if the water source lay even a few hundred paces off across broken ground, the round trip took a portion of an hour, and that trip had to be made again a few hours later, and again after that, through daylight, that in northern autumn had already shortened to 9 or 10 usable hours. The nights were the harder half. The fever ran higher after dark, as fevers generally do, and the demand for water did not stop because the light had, and the fire had to be kept alive through 14 hours of cold with fuel that had to be gathered during the day by the same small number of people. Someone stayed awake near enough to hear the change in breathing, or the sound of teeth going, or the request when it came. The pain did not last an evening. It ran through the second night, and the third and the fourth, and it did not drop between them. Someone was awake inside each of those nights. Nothing about that was written anywhere or carved into anything, and the people who did it left no mark on their own bones that we can read. The only reason we know those nights happened is that the bone in the drawer kept building. It could not have built otherwise. You have had a fever, and you know the specific quality of it, the way the cold and the heat trade places every 20 minutes, the way thirst becomes the only thought available, the way the second night is worse than the first, because the sleep debt has started to compound. Yours lasted maybe 3 days, and you spent them somewhere warm with water within arm's reach, and something to bring the temperature down. And it was still one of the more unpleasant weeks of your year. Strip out the warm room, the water within reach, and the fever-reducing thing on the shelf. Add a leg that cannot be moved without the broken ends grinding, ground temperatures near freezing after dark, and no way to know whether the fever is the ordinary kind that comes with any large fracture or the other kind that kills. The people sitting up through it had no way to tell those apart either. That distinction is where most of the deaths sat. A closed fracture, where the skin stays intact, has no route for bacteria to enter from outside, and the greatest danger through these days was blood loss and cold rather than infection. An open fracture, where a bone end came through the skin, was a different situation entirely, and in the era before any effective treatment for infection, the outcome of a major open fracture was frequently fatal within 1 to 2 weeks. Some healed limb bones in the record show a rough, laid-down layer of new bone across the surface some distance from the fracture itself, and researchers often interpret that kind of surface reaction as the trace of an infection the person fought and outlived. Those bones are the survivors of both problems at once. We cannot know how many did not survive, because the ones who died in the first fortnight left clean breaks with nothing built across them, and clean breaks tell almost no story. By the 4th day, the fever in an uncomplicated case had usually begun to settle, the swelling had reached its ceiling and stopped climbing, and the person could take a little food. Food had to be brought to a body that could not sit fully upright and could not chew hard against a jaw that had been clenched for days. Marrow from the long bones of large game was among the most useful things available in a cold landscape, being extremely energy-dense, soft enough to need no chewing at all, and obtainable from the same carcass parts that were otherwise low value. The practice of cracking limb bones for marrow shows up widely and early in the archaeological record. Fat mattered more than anything else in that climate, and it mattered more for a person burning at a raised rate while lying still. Whoever was feeding this person was giving away the best portion of what they had on the 4th day and on the 40th, and receiving nothing back that could be counted. And the people doing it had now gone 3 nights on fragments of sleep, had gathered fuel and water and food for 2 bodies rather than 1, and were themselves eating less than they otherwise would have. That arrangement had held for 4 days. The swelling had stopped growing, the fever had begun to ease, and inside the thigh, invisible to everyone, the clot between the bone ends had started to be replaced by the first soft tissue of the bridge that would eventually become the collar. It would take another 2 weeks before that bridge held anything at all. Nobody in that group knew about the bridge, or about the 2 weeks, or that the 2 weeks would then need to be followed by many more. What they knew on the 4th morning was that the person was still breathing, and that someone would have to do all of it again today, and that the question of who was going to keep doing it had not yet been settled out loud. Nobody was appointed. There is no record anywhere of a prehistoric group holding a discussion and assigning a person to the injured, and there could not be, because the kind of arrangement that gets made in the first week after an accident leaves nothing behind in the ground. What the ground does allow is a rough sense of how many people were available to make it. Most reconstructions of Upper Paleolithic band size put the number of people living and moving together at something in the low dozens, with a great deal of variation by region and season, and those bands were not composed of interchangeable adults. Subtract the children too small to fetch water any distance. Subtract the very old, whose joints in that climate were often already failing. Subtract anyone pregnant or nursing, anyone already sick, anyone whose absence from the hunt would have cost the group more than it gained. The pool of people who could actually take on the work of keeping a non-walking adult alive through a northern autumn was small, and in many cases it was 2 or 3, and sometimes it was 1. The likeliest arrangement, and the one most researchers assume without being able to prove it from any single site, is that the work fell to kin, because in small mobile groups nearly everyone was kin to nearly everyone else, and the closest relationships were the ones that could absorb this kind of cost. Beyond that, we do not know. We do not know whether the same person did it every day, or whether it rotated, whether it was mostly women or mostly men, whether it was decided at all or simply happened because someone did not leave. What can be reconstructed is not the identity, but the arithmetic. And the arithmetic is unforgiving. Start with distance. A group in a cold landscape does not camp on top of its resources. It camps at a compromise point between water, fuel, shelter from wind, and access to whatever game was moving that season, which meant water was frequently several hundred paces off, and firewood further, and both got further as the days passed and the near supply was used up. A person tending an injured adult had to make those trips anyway for themselves, and now made them for 2, carrying back in a hide fold or a length of gut what one body could drink in a sitting, which was never enough to last the day. Add the collection of fuel, which in an open landscape with few trees meant gathering dwarf willow, zung, bone, and dried brush across a wide area for a fire that had to run through 14 hours of darkness rather than being allowed to die down. Add the food, and the food is where the cost turns from time into something taken directly out of the carrier's own body, because in a cold climate foraging economy, nothing was abundant enough that a portion could be given away without being subtracted from somewhere. The injured person needed more than their usual share on account of the fever and the repair work happening in the thigh. The person feeding them had that share to find every day on top of their own, while spending hours each day on tasks that produced no food at all. There is a second subtraction that is easy to miss. The carrier was not merely doing extra work, they were also not doing the work they would otherwise have done. Hours spent at a campsite are hours not spent following game, not spent at the tool-making that kept a group equipped, not spent teaching a child how to read a track. In a group of that size, one person withdrawing from productive work for months does not vanish into a large economy. It lands on everyone, and it lands hardest on the people closest to the person who withdrew. By the 5th or 6th day, when the fever had settled and the pattern of the days had become clear enough to see its shape, that arrangement had stopped being an emergency response and had become a routine, and routines have to be paid for out of somebody's ordinary life. Sleep was the other currency. A person needing water through the night, unable to sit up, unable to move without the bone ends shifting, produced sound at intervals through the dark, and whoever was near enough to answer it was not sleeping properly. 6 nights of broken sleep leaves a person clumsy in ways that matter in a landscape where clumsiness is expensive, slower to notice a change in the wind, slower to react on wet rock. The carrier was becoming, in a small way, more likely to be the next person on the ground. Everyone involved would have understood that without needing to say it. The evidence for this second body is not entirely absent from the record. Though it does not come from the injured, it comes, in a sideways fashion, from teeth. Tooth enamel is laid down in childhood in fine layers and cannot be remodeled afterward, so a period of serious illness or malnutrition during the years a tooth is forming leaves a horizontal groove or line across its surface, a defect that stays visible for the rest of that person's life and for as long as the tooth survives afterward. These marks are common in prehistoric populations and what they record is worth sitting with, because a groove is not the mark of a child who starved. A child who starved leaves no groove. The enamel simply stops. The groove is the mark of a child who went through a season of hunger or fever bad enough to interrupt the growth of their own teeth, and then came out the other side of it and kept living for years or decades. Every one of those lines is a stretch of time during which a small body could not feed itself and did not die. Bioarchaeologists are careful with this evidence and do not read any single line as proof of a specific act of care, since the causes of enamel defects are varied and not fully understood, and the general reading, held broadly rather than in any one case, is that human groups routinely carried their weakest members through periods that should have removed them. The lines are found in the mouths of adults. That is the whole point of them. Nothing similar exists for the person who did the carrying. Their own body did not record the hours, the distance, the given away food, the interrupted sleep. There is no groove that forms in the enamel of an adult who fed someone else through a hard season, no thickening that develops on a shoulder that carried water further than it needed to, no marker at all that separates the skeleton of a person who stayed from the skeleton of a person who did not. You know the smallest version of this, and it is worth naming precisely because the small version is where most people's intuition comes from. Someone has looked after you when you could not look after yourself, and if you try to reconstruct what it cost them, you find that the details have not survived even in your own memory. You remember being brought things. You do not know how many trips it took, or what they gave up that week, or whether they slept. The record of the person doing the caring is thin, even when it happened in your own house, within your own lifetime, to people you could still ask. Multiply that thinness by 40,000 years. In the week after the accident, then, 2 bodies were being run down at once, and only one of them was visibly injured. The person on the ground was burning through their reserves at an elevated rate, while lying still, losing muscle in the leg already, hot and thirsty and in pain that had not stopped since the light went low on the first afternoon. The person tending them was eating less than they needed, sleeping in fragments, walking further each day as the near fuel ran out, and doing it without any way to know how long the arrangement would have to hold. Neither of those situations was improving on the 6th day. By then the thigh had begun to bruise visibly as the blood that had filled the muscle worked its way toward the surface, spreading down toward the knee, in colors that changed over the following week, which is the ordinary course of a large closed fracture, and would have looked to anyone watching like something getting worse, rather than something resolving. The mornings were colder than they had been at the start. The light was arriving later and leaving sooner, a few minutes each day, and the whole group could feel the season turning underneath them while one of their number lay unable to stand. The person doing the fetching went out again for water, over ground that had frozen hard overnight and was thawing to mud by mid-morning, and came back and went out again. That is the entire record of what they did. It exists nowhere except in the fact that the thigh bone in the drawer went on healing. The 2nd week is where the emergency ends and the work begins, and the difference between those two things is not obvious until you have lived through both. An emergency has an edge to it that keeps people moving. What replaced it, somewhere around the 8th or 9th day, was a set of tasks that had to be done in a particular order several times a day, with no visible result at the end of any of them, for a length of time nobody could estimate. Inside the thigh, meanwhile, something was finally happening that would have been worth knowing about and was completely invisible. The clot that had filled the gap between the bone ends was being replaced by a soft mass of cartilage and fibrous tissue laid down by cells migrating in from the sleeve of tissue that wraps every long bone, and by roughly 2 weeks after a fracture, that soft bridge has usually formed across the break. It is not bone yet. It has almost no strength, and a leg at that stage will still bend at the fracture if it is handled carelessly, which is precisely why the second and third weeks demanded so much handling by other people rather than less. The person could feel a change and would have reported the pain easing, which was true and also entirely misleading, and anyone in that group who took the easing as a sign that the leg could take weight would have undone 2 weeks in a single afternoon, begin with the water, because it never stopped being the largest single item. A body repairing a major fracture in a dry, cold climate needs a steady intake through the day, and no container available in that era held more than a few mouthfuls worth compared to modern vessels. A hide fold leaks and cannot be set down. A gut length holds a decent amount but has to be handled carefully and does not last many weeks before it splits or spoils. A hollowed section of large limb bone is rigid and useful but small. Whatever was in use, the practical result was the same. Several trips a day, each one out and back across whatever distance separated the camp from the water, each trip perhaps a quarter or a third of an hour depending on the ground, sometimes more. Once the surface froze at night and thawed to churned mud by mid-morning. 4 trips a day is an hour and a half. It was 4 trips a day for weeks. Then the food, which was not simply a matter of handing something over. A person lying flat cannot chew hard against a jaw that has been clenched for days, cannot sit fully upright without the leg protesting, and cannot manage anything that requires effort to break down. Food had to be made soft. In a cold climate foraging economy, this meant marrow, which needed no chewing at all and carried more energy per mouthful than almost anything else available. It meant fat rendered off a carcass. It meant meat pounded between 2 stones until the fibers gave way, which takes real time and produces a small quantity. It meant, in some regions and seasons, plant tissue softened by long heating near a fire. Each of those requires a person to do it, sitting down, using their hands, producing food for someone else, while their own share sat unattended. The preparation was a second meal's worth of labor on top of the first. Then the body itself, which is the part people flinch from, and which occupied more of the day than anything except the water. A person who cannot shift their own weight develops pressure sores, and they develop faster than most people assume. Skin over a bony prominence, with body weight resting on it, loses its blood supply, and tissue starved of blood begins to break down within a few hours, which is why the standard instruction in modern care of an immobile patient is to change their position every couple of hours around the clock. The places at risk are the ones with the least padding between bone and surface: the base of the spine, the outer hips, the heels, the shoulder blades. A sore that opens on a person lying on hide over cold ground with no way to clean it is an entry point for infection in a body that had so far avoided one, and the fracture that had healed cleanly could still be killed from the tailbone, so the person had to be turned every few hours, through the day and through the night, by someone strong enough to move an adult in a way that did not let the thigh rotate. That cannot be done alone and cannot be done gently enough to be painless. Every single turn hurt, every few hours, for weeks. Add the waste, which had to be dealt with by hand by whoever was there, in the cold, several times a day, with no water to spare for washing and no soap of any kind in existence. Nobody records this, and nobody ever has. It is the largest omission in every account of prehistoric care ever written, and it accounted for more of the daily hours than the food did. Add warmth, which in that climate meant a fire alive through 14 hours of dark and lengthening, meaning fuel gathered in daylight across an area that widened every week as the near supply was used up, meaning the fetching distance grew steadily just as the days got shorter. Add the checking through the night, the being awake to hear, the not quite sleeping that is different from sleeplessness and worse in some ways than being fully awake. Put it together, and the daily total for one person, doing the water and the food preparation and the turning and the cleaning and the fuel, sits somewhere in the range of 5 or 6 hours of direct work on top of everything they would ordinarily have done to keep themselves alive. Not one day, not the dramatic first week. Every day, through the second week and the third and the fourth, while the bridge inside the thigh was still soft enough to bend, with no marker anywhere to indicate progress and nothing to say when it would end. You know the 2-day version of this. Somebody has slept badly on a chair near you, brought things without being asked, done something for your body you would rather nobody had had to do, and by the 3rd day the strain had begun to show around their eyes, in a way you noticed and felt bad about. That was 3 days, with running water, with a chemist open, with a bed for them to go home to. Multiply the days by 40. Take away the tap. There is a thing worth saying plainly about the people doing this, because the temptation in this genre is to make them saintly, and they were not saintly. They were people in a cold place, with a limited food supply, doing work that had no reward attached to it. The care itself, though, was not crude. Groups who managed to keep an adult alive through a femoral fracture in these conditions were doing something that required knowing the person had to be turned, knowing the leg had to be kept still, knowing that food had to be softened, and knowing that a fire had to be held rather than allowed to gutter. None of that is instinctive. It is knowledge, held by people without writing, passed forward by having been done before and watched. What they lacked was not understanding. It was everything that would have made the understanding cheap to act on. By the end of the 4th week, the bridge across the fracture had begun to harden as mineral was laid into it, converting soft callus into the rough cuff of woven bone that would eventually become the collar in the drawer. The leg still could not take any weight at all. The muscle of the thigh had visibly shrunk, the whole limb thinner than the other one and slack where it had been solid. The person on the ground had been lying in one place for a month, and the person tending them had done 5 or 6 hours a day for 30 days without missing one, which is roughly 170 hours of work that nobody counted and nobody thanked them for. And both of them were now heading into the part of the year when the ground froze properly, and the group would have to decide what to do about a body that still could not walk. The carrier had a body too, and by the end of the first month that body had been running at a deficit for 30 days without anyone treating it as a problem, because it was still upright and still walking, and in a small group the standard for concern was fairly high. What that body was actually doing, in the ordinary accounting of calories and hours and sleep, is worth going through, partly because nobody ever does, and partly because it turns out to be a more hopeful stretch of this than the last one was. Start with sleep, since it was the item under the most pressure. A person answering a call in the night and turning an adult every few hours does not get long unbroken stretches, and what they get instead is fragmented sleep, which is not the same quantity spread differently. Sleep runs in cycles of roughly 90 minutes, and the deeper stages that do the most repair sit toward the back end of a cycle, so a night interrupted every 2 or 3 hours delivers a disproportionate loss of exactly the part that matters. The effects show up quickly and are consistent. Slower reaction time, worse fine motor control, a drop in the ability to hold a plan in mind and follow it through. In a landscape where the difference between eating and not eating could come down to noticing a track in poor light that mattered. And yet, the human body has one useful trick here, which is that fragmented sleep is survivable for a remarkably long time when the total is adequate and there is a decent argument made by several researchers studying sleep in non-industrial societies, that segmented night sleep with waking periods in the middle was closer to the human norm than the single consolidated block modern people expect. A person waking 3 times a night in a cold camp was not in unfamiliar territory. They were tired, not broken. Then the food, which was the harder arithmetic, the carrier was giving away a portion of their own intake to someone whose demand had risen, while spending 5 or 6 hours a day on tasks that produced nothing edible in a season when the days were shortening and the game was moving. A body in modest energy deficit does not simply shrink at a steady rate, it adjusts. Metabolic rate drops within days, sometimes substantially, as the body reduces its own running costs. Movement becomes more economical without any decision being made about it. The efficiency of digestion rises slightly. Fat stores release their contents in an orderly sequence, and in a cold-adapted population there was usually something there to release. None of that is comfortable. All of it works. A healthy adult can carry a deficit of that scale for weeks, while continuing to function at a level that looks, from the outside, close to normal, and that capacity is not an accident. It is one of the more thoroughly tested features of the human body, refined across a very long history of food arriving unevenly. The carrier was using a system built precisely for this. There is also the cold, which was doing its own work on them. Sitting still beside a person who cannot be left in a camp in late autumn is colder than walking, and the body's response to sustained cold exposure is a raised metabolic rate, which is to say, the carrier's own fuel requirement went up at the same time as their intake went down. Shivering alone can multiply resting energy use several times over for as long as it lasts. Over weeks of this, cold-exposed people show measurable adaptations. Better blood flow control to the hands so that fingers stay usable longer at low temperatures. A higher tolerance for discomfort before shivering starts, and in some populations an increase in the tissue that generates heat without muscle activity. The hands mattered most. Fingers that stay working at low temperature are fingers that can still knot a cord, still handle a blade, still fasten a hide around someone. Their body was adjusting toward the exact task it had been given, without being asked and without anyone noticing. What none of this means is that the arrangement was sustainable indefinitely. And the honest position is that we cannot know how long any particular person could have held it, because the variables were enormous. How good the season was, how many other adults were available, whether the group was moving or settled, how far the water was. What can be said is narrower and better supported. Human groups did manage this more than once, in more than one region, across a long stretch of the record, and the evidence for it is the same evidence that started this whole thing: bones that healed. Every healed major fracture in the record is a case where somebody's body held out long enough. What we do not have, and never will, is the count of the times it did not. This is the point at which it is worth resisting a certain instinct, because there is a version of this story where the people involved are pitiful, and that version is wrong. They were not helpless. They were operating a system of care with real knowledge behind it, using bodies that adjusted to the load in an environment they understood well enough to have lived in for generations. The metabolic drop, the sleep tolerance, the hand adaptations to cold, these were not endurance in the heroic sense. They were competence at the level of tissue. The group had built practices around this too, and though the details are beyond recovery, the structure is visible in outline. Someone had to know how to soften food, how to turn a body, how to hold a fire through a long night, how to keep a leg still. Knowledge like that does not appear once. It gets passed forward because it worked before. Whoever was doing this had almost certainly seen it done. You have felt an edge of this and probably filed it under something else. The stretch when you were running on too little sleep and too much responsibility, and discovered, somewhere in the middle of it, that you were still functioning, that your body had quietly lowered its own demands and got on with it, that you were not enjoying any of it, but you were doing it. That capacity is not a modern development. It is very old, and it is one of the more reliable things about the human body, and it is the reason the bone in the drawer was able to keep building through a month when nobody had anything spare. There were limits, and they were real, and this is not an argument that the carrier was fine. By the 5th week, their own weight had dropped noticeably. Their hands were rougher and slower to warm, and the accumulated sleep debt had reached the point where their judgment in the field was worse than it had been at the start. In a group operating with narrow margins, a slightly impaired adult is a real cost, and the people around them would have seen it. What they would also have seen, and this is the part that changes the shape of the story, is that the person on the ground was still alive at a stage when most of the deaths from this injury had already happened. The fever had passed. No sore had opened. The bruising down the thigh had faded from black through green to a dull yellow at the knee. The cuff of new bone across the fracture was hardening week by week toward something that would eventually take weight. Inside the leg, an outcome was becoming possible that had not been possible in the first days, and it was becoming possible because of hours that nobody wrote down, done by a body that had adjusted itself to make them affordable. The cost was being paid out of muscle and sleep and body fat, and it was being paid successfully. That was the state of things when the frost stopped lifting during the day, and the group had to face the question they had been able to postpone for as long as the weather allowed, which was what happens when the whole camp needs to move and one person still cannot stand. A group in a cold landscape does not move because it wants to. It moves because the reasons to stay have run out, and by the 6th week, those reasons had been running out steadily, in a way everyone could measure. The fuel within easy walking distance had been burned. A fire held through 14 hours of darkness every night, for 40 nights, consumes an enormous quantity of dwarf willow and dried brush and zung, and the gathering radius had widened until a fuel trip took most of a morning. The waste of a camp accumulates, and a camp holding a person who cannot walk away from it accumulates faster. Water sources that had run freely in early autumn were skimming over at the edges each night and taking longer each morning to open. Above all, the game had moved, following its own seasonal logic, to lower ground or different ground, and a group that stayed while the herds left was a group choosing to eat its reserves through the coldest part of the year. Everyone in that camp knew the calendar of this without needing to name it, because they had done it every year of their lives, and their parents had done it before them. What was different this year was that one adult could not stand up. There were 4 things that could happen, and it is worth walking through each of them because the arithmetic is what makes this hard, rather than any absence of feeling. The group could stay where it was, which meant a winter spent in a place already stripped of fuel, away from the game, on reserves that had not been laid in for that purpose. The group could split, leaving some adults behind with the injured person, while the rest followed the season, which halves the effectiveness of both parties in a landscape where a small number of people is already close to the minimum for safety at night and for handling large carcasses. The group could carry the person, which is the option most people assume first and is the most expensive of the 4, or the group could go without them. That last option existed. It has to be said plainly rather than skirted, because pretending otherwise would make the healed bones meaningless. The whole reason a healed femur is remarkable is that leaving was available and was sometimes taken, and we have no way at all of counting how often. What the record preserves is only the outcomes where it was not taken. Carrying, then, Since carrying is where the physical cost becomes concrete, there were no wheels 40,000 years ago, and there would not be for tens of thousands of years more. There were no harnessed animals. The domestication of the dog is debated, and the earliest proposed evidence is contested, and in any case, a dog does not move an adult human. What existed was poles, hide, cordage, and other people's shoulders. A stretcher of 2 shafts, with a hide slung between them, requires 2 adults to lift and carry, and those 2 adults are then carrying nothing else, no meat, no tools, no fuel, no child, over frozen uneven ground with a load of that weight. A carrying party covers a fraction of the distance a walking group covers in a day, and every stumble goes straight through a fracture that has been knitting for 6 weeks and is still, at that stage, a cuff of rough new bone rather than anything solid. A drag frame of 2 poles trailing on the ground is easier on the carriers and worse on the passenger. Either way, the whole group moves at the pace of the slowest part of itself, in the season when moving slowly is the most expensive thing available, and the group had other people in it who were not fast. Small children walk short distances and then need carrying themselves. Older adults in that climate frequently had joints that had been failing for years. Anyone pregnant moved carefully. A band was never composed only of strong walkers. It was always already carrying somebody, and the injured adult was an addition to a load that was not empty to begin with. That is the point where the arithmetic stops being about one person and becomes about the whole shape of a group. The extra mouth had to be fed from a supply that was about to become harder to fill. The extra body had to be sheltered in whatever the group could build against the wind. The watch through the night had to be kept by the same small number of adults, one of whom was already sleeping in fragments, and a person on the ground who cannot get up is a person the watch has to account for separately. The record has almost nothing direct to say about how any of this was resolved. Group decisions leave no trace. There is no artifact class that preserves a discussion. What the record does contain, in scattered and hard-won pieces from across the Upper Paleolithic and earlier, is a set of individuals who lived into adulthood with conditions that would have severely restricted their ability to move or to feed themselves, and whose skeletons show years of survival after the point where independence ended. Researchers are careful with these cases and disagree about how much can be read from any one of them, and the general position, held broadly rather than about any particular individual, is that these people did not survive by accident. A group that keeps a non-walking adult alive across seasons is a group that has absorbed that person into how it moves. It is not one dramatic act of rescue. It is a permanent adjustment to the pace of everything. What that adjustment cost is invisible. In exactly the same way, the daily care was invisible. There is no marker on a skeleton for a person who walks slower for a season. There is no trace on a hip that carried the front end of a stretcher for a week of frozen mornings. There is no way to distinguish, in a drawer of bones, the ones who went ahead from the ones who stayed back and matched their step to someone else's. The only evidence that the adjustment happened is the person it was made for, still breathing, years later, with a thickened collar on one femur. Consider the timing of when this had to be settled. Not on the first night, when everyone was still moving on adrenaline and the question could be deferred until morning. Not in the second week, when the fever was the whole of the problem and nothing beyond the next day needed deciding. It came at 6 weeks, when the crisis had flattened out into routine, when the person had already been kept alive at considerable expense, when the ones doing the keeping were thinner and slower than they had been, and when the weather made the deadline for itself. There was no way to wait it out. There was no arrangement that could be made with the season. There was nothing that could be sent for. and nowhere to leave a person that was not simply the ground, and whatever the group settled on, it was settled within earshot of the person it was about. They were lying right there. They could hear it being worked out. There is a further thing about that position which is rarely said and belongs here. A person 6 weeks into a femoral fracture is not confused or unaware. The fever has gone. The pain has dropped to a background level. The mind is entirely intact. What has gone is every means of acting on anything. They could not offer to make it easier. They could not go and fetch anything to offset what they cost. They could not walk out and remove the problem. The only thing available to them was to lie still and let other people work out what to do about their body, and that state had been going on for 40 days and had no visible end. You have had a narrow version of this, and it was probably the worst part of being ill, not the symptoms, but lying somewhere hearing other people rearrange their day around you and being unable to do anything except be the reason for it. Yours lasted a week. Then the frost stopped lifting by midday, and the light was down to 8 usable hours, and the decision could not be postponed any longer. By the 8th week, the leg had stopped being an emergency and had become a fact, and the difference showed in how little anyone talked about it. The thigh had gone down to something close to its normal outline, though the outline itself had changed. The muscle had thinned enough that the shape of the bone could be traced along the front of it, and the swelling that remained sat in a hard band around the fracture, rather than spreading down the limb. The bruising was gone entirely. The pain had dropped to something the person could hold a conversation through, present but no longer occupying everything, flaring only when the leg was moved and settling again afterward. Inside, the cuff of new bone had continued to mineralize, and by around 6 to 8 weeks after a fracture of that size, the callus in an adult is usually hard enough to be described as united, which is a word that carries a great deal of misunderstanding inside it. United does not mean strong. It means the two ends are connected by bone rather than by cartilage. A hard callus at that stage has a fraction of the strength of the original shaft, and its density and organization are wrong. Woven bone laid down quickly in disordered fibers, rather than the tight, parallel structure that makes a healthy femur able to take 4 or 5 times body weight without complaint. The remodeling that turns one into the other takes months at minimum and years to finish. So the leg at 8 weeks was a leg that looked much better, hurt much less, and would still have broken again under a full step. The days had settled into something with a rhythm to it. Water still came 4 times, but the person could now hold the container themselves and drink without help, which removed one small item from someone else's day. They could sit propped for stretches, which meant they could eat ordinary food rather than food someone had softened, and that removed another. They could shift their own upper body enough to relieve the pressure points that mattered most, which meant the turning through the night dropped from every few hours to something less frequent, and the person doing it began to get longer runs of sleep than they had managed since the first week. Their weight, which had dropped through the second month, stopped dropping. Their hands warmed faster in the mornings. None of that was noticed as a recovery by anyone. It simply became the ordinary condition of the camp. Work resumed in the way work does. Hide was being scraped and worked, which is a task that occupies hands for long stretches and can be done sitting down, and there is a reasonable case that a person immobilized with a healing leg became useful at exactly this kind of thing, since a body that cannot walk still has 2 working arms and a great deal of time. Stone was being knapped. Cordage was being twisted. Someone was keeping a fire. In the evenings, the group was doing whatever it did in the evenings, and the person on the ground was part of it rather than the subject of it, and the distinction between those 2 positions is one of the more significant things that had changed since the 6th week. The winter was doing its ordinary work outside all of this. The light had come down to 7 or 8 usable hours and was still shortening toward the solstice. The ground had frozen through rather than thawing by mid-morning, which made walking easier in some ways than the mud had been. The cold had settled into the steady kind rather than the sharp kind. Food was harder than it had been in autumn, and the group was eating into what it had, which is what every group in that latitude did every year and had always done. The main thing about these weeks is that nothing much happened in them. That is worth stating rather than working around, because a long run of nothing much is the actual texture of most of a recovery, and a story that jumps from the crisis to the outcome removes the part that took the longest. 8 weeks in, the arrangement that had been an emergency response was simply how this group lived now. Someone still fetched more water than they would have. Someone still gave up a portion of what they ate. The night watch was still arranged around a person who could not get up quickly. It had all become unremarkable, which is a different thing from having become easy. The person on the ground had now been unable to stand for 2 months, and what 2 months does to a body that is not being used is the part of this that nobody in that camp could see. And that turns out to matter more than anything visible. Muscle that is not loaded is dismantled. The process begins within days of immobilization and moves faster than most people expect, with measurable loss of muscle cross-section in the thigh appearing in the first week or two and continuing steadily afterward. The muscles that extend the knee are among the quickest to go, and studies of limb immobilization commonly find losses on the order of several % of muscle volume within the first fortnight, with the decline continuing well beyond that. Bone does the same thing. A skeleton maintains its density in response to load, and a bone that carries no weight begins losing mineral, which is why the femur in the drawer, if the injury was severe enough and the immobilization long enough, sometimes shows not only the collar at the fracture, but a thinner, lighter shaft below it, and muscle attachment ridges that have faded from the surface. The break was healing. Everything around the break was being taken apart. It is the strange arithmetic at the center of this whole thing, and nobody in that group had any way to know about it. Every week that the leg was protected correctly, sensibly, in the only way that would let the bone knit at all, was a week that took away some of what the leg would need in order to be used again. The two processes ran at the same time in the same limb, and one of them was visible as a lump under the skin and the other was completely silent. So the calm of these weeks was real, and the sense that the hard part was over was not unreasonable, and it was also incomplete in a way that only becomes clear later. The fever was long past. No sore had opened. The fracture had united. The group had gone through the season's move, or had made its arrangement whatever it was, and had come out the other side of that decision still holding this person. The person could sit, drink, eat, work with their hands, and talk through an evening. Everyone had been through the worst of it and knew it. What they did not know is what happens when someone who has been lying down for 2 months finally tries to stand. The first attempt to stand happened somewhere around the 10th week, and it did not go the way anyone expected, because everyone in that camp was watching the wrong part of the leg. The fracture held. That was the thing they were braced for, and it was fine. The cuff of new bone across the shaft took the load without giving, and whatever pain came through, it was the ordinary complaint of a healed break being asked to work, rather than the sharp specific wrongness of something coming apart. What failed was everything else. A thigh that has not carried weight for 2 months has lost a substantial portion of the muscle that extends the knee, and the loss is not spread evenly through the limb, but concentrated exactly where standing requires it. So the leg that came underneath that body was thinner than the other one, slack along the front, and unable to lock the knee against the weight above it. It buckled. Balance is not a property of the legs alone. It is maintained by a continuous stream of information from receptors in the muscles and joints reporting position and load, and that system degrades when it goes unused, which means a person standing for the first time in 2 months is receiving poor information from a limb that could not act on it anyway. There is also the circulation, which adjusts within days to a body that lies flat and takes weeks to readjust to one that does not. So the first minutes upright brought the greyed vision and the roaring in the ears and the cold sweat of a person whose blood pressure had not caught up with their posture. They went back down, not from the fracture, from 2 months of lying still. What that meant, in the practical accounting of that winter, is that the moment everyone had been waiting for turned out not to be an ending at all. The bone was united at 10 weeks. Walking any useful distance was months further off, because muscle rebuilds more slowly than it disappears, and rebuilds only in response to being loaded, which requires standing, which requires muscle. That circle had to be broken slowly, and from the outside. Weight had to be put through the leg in increments, a little more each week, with someone bracing the person on the weak side and taking the difference through their own shoulder. And every one of those sessions was another person's time and another person's back. In between, the leg had to be moved and stretched, because a joint held in one position for weeks stiffens as the tissue around it shortens and tightens, and a knee that has been straight for 2 months does not simply bend when asked. Someone had to bend it, repeatedly, against resistance, in a way that hurt, while the person it belonged to lay there and let them. And all of this was happening in midwinter, in the shortest and hardest weeks of the year, at exactly the point when the camp had the least to spare and when the injury had stopped being interesting to anybody. That last part is the one worth staying with, because it is where this whole story turns over. Emergencies collect help. Everyone knows what to do in the first night. There is no ambiguity about whether to carry someone off frozen ground or whether to bring water to a person burning with fever. The difficulty of the first week is not that it is hard to motivate, but that it is hard to do. The difficulty of the 4th month is entirely different. By then, nothing looks urgent. The person is sitting up, talking, working hide with their hands, visibly not dying. The fracture is a lump under the skin that everyone has stopped noticing. There is no crisis to point at and no obvious reason for anyone to still be adjusting their day around it. And yet the water still had to be fetched further than it would have been, the leg still had to be bent and braced and walked, and the portion of food still had to come from somewhere it would otherwise not have come from. The most demanding stretch of this arrangement, measured in weeks, came after everyone had stopped thinking of it as an event. Go back to the bone in the drawer, because it records this, and it records it in more than one place. The collar around the fracture is the obvious mark, and it is the one anyone would notice first, a cuff of woven bone laid down fast and then slowly filed back toward the shape of the shaft over the following years. That filing is itself a measurement. Remodeling only happens in a living skeleton, and it only proceeds while the bone is being loaded, so a collar that has been partly smoothed down is a collar that spent years afterward inside a person who walked. But look further along the same bone, and there is a second record, quieter and easier to miss. The shaft below the break is sometimes thinner and lighter than its opposite number, because bone that carries no weight loses mineral, and the ridge along the back, where the great muscles of the thigh attach, can be shallower on that side, faded where the pull that maintains it went slack. Those marks are not from the accident, they are from the months of not standing, and they can persist for the rest of a person's life, which means the bone carries a permanent trace of exactly the period when the injury had stopped looking like an injury. And the two halves of the shaft, when they healed out of line, left the leg an inch or two short. So the person walked afterward with a permanent limp, throwing weight onto the other hip, wearing the joints on that side unevenly for however many years remained, And the skeleton records that too. Every one of those features is a mark on the body of the person who could not stand. Now look for the other one. There is nothing. No bone in any collection anywhere carries a mark that identifies its owner as someone who fetched water for another adult 4 times a day for a season. The skeleton of a person who gave away part of every meal for 4 months is not distinguishable from the skeleton of a person who did not. There is no ridge that forms from bracing someone's weight through a winter, no groove from nights spent listening instead of sleeping, no signature at all for staying. Whoever did this is present in the record in exactly one way, and it is the whole of what we have. The bone healed. Then it kept being used for years. Someone was still doing this in the 4th month when nothing about it was urgent anymore and no one was watching. That is the evidence. There is no other. Everything else about that person has gone. What they looked like, what they were owed, whether they resented any of it, whether anyone ever acknowledged it, whether they were young or old, or which of the two of them died first. What survived is a thickened collar of bone that could only have formed inside a living body, on a shaft that shows the wasting of months without weight, on a leg that later walked well enough to file that collar part-way down again. Read backward. That is a person who lay on the ground through a northern winter and came out of it walking. Read 1 step further back. It is a second person, standing behind the first in the record and visible only through them, who did the thing that has to have been done and left no other mark on the world. The spring did not arrive all at once, and neither did the walking, and by the time the ground softened, the leg was taking most of a step on its own, and the arrangement that had held since autumn was beginning, slowly, to become unnecessary. Most of them did not heal. That has to be said directly, because everything up to this point has followed one bone through to an outcome, and one bone is not the pattern. It is the exception that survived long enough to be found. And a drawer of femurs from any prehistoric collection holds more clean breaks than collars. A clean break is a fracture with 2 sharp ends, and nothing built across the gap, no cuff, no bridge, no sign that the body ever began the work, and what it means is straightforward and does not require any interpretation. The person died before healing could start. Days, in most cases. Sometimes hours. The reasons are the ones already laid out, arriving in the same order. Blood loss came first, in the hours after the break, and a femoral fracture that put too much into the thigh took the person down through cold hands and confusion before anyone had worked out what to do about the night. Cold came next, on that first night and the ones after, because a body low on volume cannot hold its temperature, and a fire was not always close enough or fed well enough. Then infection, which was the whole of the problem when a bone end had come through the skin. An open femoral fracture in the era before any effective treatment for infection was, as far as anyone can tell, close to a sentence, and the record of it, in bone, is a rough spreading layer of reactive surface, where the body fought something it did not win, and then the slower ones. A pressure sore that opened at the base of the spine in the 3rd week and went down through the tissue to bone. A chest that filled because a person lay flat for 2 months and could not clear it. A group that ran short in a bad winter and could not carry 2 bodies' worth of need through to spring. None of those show up as anything dramatic. They show up as a skeleton that stops. There is a harder category, and it is the one this whole account has been standing on. Some people were not left in the first hours, and were not lost to the fever, and the arrangement held for weeks, and then it ended anyway. Someone fetched water and softened food and turned a body for a month, and the person died in the 2nd month, and the bone in the ground shows a callus that started forming and never finished. Those bones exist. A partial callus is the mark of care that was real, that was given daily, that was sufficient for a while, and that was not enough. Nothing about that failure was a mistake. They did not lack the knowledge. They knew to keep the leg still, to soften the food, to turn the body, to hold the fire. What they lacked was the transfusion, the antibiotic, the rod through the shaft, the 6 weeks of someone else's food supply arriving without anyone having to walk for it. The gap between what they did and what would have been needed was not a gap in intelligence or in effort. It was a gap in tools, and tools were the one thing that could not be improvised out of willingness. We have no way to count any of this. The proportions are unrecoverable because the bones that reached us are a filtered sample of a filtered sample. What survived burial? What survived 40,000 years of ground chemistry? What happened to be excavated? What happened to be recognized? Anyone who gives you a percentage for how many prehistoric femoral fractures healed is guessing. What can be said is only the direction. The healed ones are the minority in every collection where anyone has looked, and the number of times a group did all of this and lost the person anyway is a number that does not exist anywhere and never will. There is one more thing in the ground that belongs here, and then this can be left alone. Burials from the Upper Paleolithic are rare, and most people in that era were not buried in any way that preserved. Some were, and in some of those, the body was placed rather than left, laid in a particular position, sometimes with objects, sometimes with ochre, worked into the ground around them. Archaeologists are careful about what can be read from this and do not agree on what any specific arrangement meant. The narrowest reading, and the one that holds regardless of interpretation, is that arranging a body takes time and takes hands, and it is done after the point where anything can be gained. Someone dug into frozen or half-frozen ground with the tools available. Someone put the body in a position rather than a heap. That was the last piece of work in a sequence of work that had been going on, in some cases, for months. It produced nothing. They did it anyway. And then the group moved on, because the season required it. And whoever had been doing the fetching went back to fetching only for themselves. And the space that had been arranged around one person closed up. There is no record of what that was like. There is only the ground, and a skeleton with a fracture that had begun to knit, a number of stopped. Spring in the north does not announce itself. The ground softens from the top down over a run of days, the frost letting go by mid-morning instead of holding through noon, meltwater running in thin channels between stones, and making a sound at the edge of the camp that had not been there since autumn, and the light stretching back out toward 12 hours in a way that everyone notices only after it has already happened. By then, the leg was taking most of a step. The walking that came back was not the walking that had gone. The healed shaft was an inch or so shorter than its opposite number, and the two halves had knit at a slight angle, so the body compensated with every stride, dropping toward the short side and throwing extra load onto the other hip, and that pattern stayed for the rest of that person's life and wore the joints on the good side unevenly enough that a skeleton can still show it. The distances came back slowly, and in a particular order, across the camp, then to the water, then far enough out to be useful, then far enough to keep up with a group that was moving. Somewhere, in that sequence, the arrangement ended, and it ended without a moment. Nobody in that camp could have said which day was the last day of it. One morning, someone did not go for the extra water because there was no longer any reason to, and that was the end of a thing that had run since the light went low on an afternoon the previous autumn, and it passed without being marked in any way at all, which raises the question this whole account has been circling, and the honest answer is that we do not know. Why anyone did this is not a thing that survives. The bone records the outcome and says nothing about motive and the various explanations that get offered, that these were close kin, that help given was help expected back, that a group with an adult's accumulated knowledge in it was better off keeping that adult alive are reasonable, and are also unprovable in any particular case, and none of them account for the shape of what actually happened. Because if the arrangement had been about return on investment, it should have ended in the second month when the person was clearly not going to be productive that year. If it had been about the drama of a rescue, it should have ended when the drama did, somewhere around the 6th week. The record shows the opposite. It shows the work continuing through the exact stretch when nothing was urgent, nobody was watching, no result was visible, and the effort was at its least rewarding. Whatever was going on there, it was not calculation, and it kept going in the 4th month. That is the thing worth sitting with, rather than the crisis. And it is why this story is finally about competence more than suffering. These were people who understood that a leg had to be kept still, and then, later, had to be moved. Who knew food could be softened, that a body left in one position breaks down, that a fire held through 14 hours of dark is not the same as a fire lit twice? That knowledge was not written and could not be looked up, and it existed anyway, passed forward by having been done in front of somebody who then did it themselves. Every group that managed this was operating a system, and the system was made of hands and hours and things people had watched their own parents do. What they lacked was tools, and the whole distance between their outcomes and ours is a distance of equipment, not of understanding or of care. There is also a detail in the record that changes how this reads at the end, and it is easy to walk past. The same populations that contain skeletons of people who were cared for contain skeletons of people who did the caring, and they are frequently the same skeletons. A person carried through a broken leg at 20 is a person who lives another 30 years and is present in the camp when someone else goes down. The lines across tooth enamel from a childhood illness are in the mouths of adults who went on to be the ones fetching water for somebody else. Whatever this was, it was not a transaction between a strong person and a weak one. It was a thing that moved through a group over a lifetime, and everybody was on both ends of it at different points, which is the part that reaches all the way here. You have been the body on the ground. Everybody has. And for most people, it was not an injury. It was the beginning. A human infant cannot follow, cannot feed itself, cannot regulate its own temperature, and cannot do any of those things for a length of time that is unusual and is measured in years rather than weeks. Somebody carried you. Somebody was awake in the dark, listening for a change in your breathing, and brought you what you needed and got no result they could point at for a very long time. And behind them, the same. And behind them, the same again, all the way back past the point where any of it was written down through every one of those winters in an unbroken line that cannot have been interrupted even once, because a single break in, it ends the line and you are not here. Everyone alive is the surviving end of a chain of people who stayed. The bone in the drawer is one link that happens to be visible. He broke his leg 40,000 years ago and survived. How? The bone answers half of that and refuses the rest. It can tell us the fracture united, that the leg was used for years afterward, that the shaft thinned during the months without weight, and that the muscle attachments faded and slowly came back. It cannot tell us who fetched the water. It cannot tell us how many people that took, whether they resented it, whether anyone ever said anything about it, or which of them died first. That information was never recorded anywhere, and there is no method that will recover it. What remains is a shape in the evidence, a gap the size of a person, standing behind the one we can see, defined entirely by work that must have been done and that left no trace of itself. That absence is the most reliable thing in the whole record. It is exactly the shape of the ordinary case. Almost none of the work that keeps people alive gets written down. It happens in the 4th month, after the visitors stop coming. in the stretch where nothing looks urgent and the person is sitting up and talking and no longer interesting to anyone, and it is done by somebody who is tired and thinner than they were and has no idea when it ends. That was true in a cold camp 40,000 years ago, and it is true this week. In a house somewhere near you, and probably in your own, in either direction. If there is anything to take from a thickened collar of bone in a drawer, it might be this: the work does not leave a mark, and the person doing it will not be thanked in any way proportionate to what it costs. And it is still the only reason any of us are here at all. Somebody is likely doing it for you right now, or did once, or will. It will not show up on your bones either. Sleep well.